I'm apologizing to anybody at home. I have not much of a voice, but I'm doing the best I can. Roll call vote, please. I mean, not roll call. Roll call.
Commissioner Hershey,
Here.
Commissioner George,
Here.
Commissioner Knapp,
Here.
Commissioner Colbert,
Here.
Commissioner Treadwell,
Here.
Commissioner Tuller,
Here.
Commissioner Anna Deturi is absent, and other than that, we have a quorum.
Thank goodness. Okay, we're moving down to topics for consideration. Do we have to take those separately, or can we do it together?
You can do it together.
Okay, so it would be approval of the minutes of August 1st and of September 6th, 2023. Was that correction made?
No, but it will be.
Okay.
I think Laura can speak to that part.
Yeah, so the way that the minutes are put together in iCompass, there is a general template, and that is something I've been working to update, but it's something I'm going to have to work with the clerk's office to update because it keeps carrying over people, and so I have to take out Janet Fleshman and Mark Wilson and add in
Right.
Knapp and Gobert, so I have to just iron that out, and so there was a little typo where it mentioned Chairperson Hassing presiding at a meeting,
On the September 6th.
and that was something that I just need to edit out in the template so that it doesn't
So
carry over.
whoever makes the motion can just amend it to, for the September 6th, amend
Chan-
it.
Channel 9 and 10 are still showing footage of David Hassing leading the meetings.
Oh, okay, well, fine. But whoever makes the motion, just amend the September 6th to say that Vice Chairperson Anna Deturi ran the meeting. So do I have a motion for approval of those two sets of minutes?
Yes, I move that we accept those minutes as amended.
Support.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Okay, next we're going to move down to the public hearing and consideration of a conditional rezoning request submitted by Homestretch Nonprofit Housing Corporation for the property located at 1028 Carver Street. Mr. Winter.
Yeah, thank you. This is the public hearing that was introduced back in September. If you recall in the discussion we had then, this project was originally approved in 2020. Once approved, the applicant, through their nonprofit housing corporation, is then put in position to be able to go after the state funding that's necessary and all the applicable financing. Around that time, 2020, COVID was in full effect and definitely slowed things down, and these processes are slow by nature to begin with, without that added burden in there. So this was a conditional rezoning to rezone this to multifamily to allow for 10 affordable dwelling units between 3 separate structures. Conditional rezoning is only good for 2 years and has the opportunity for one-year extension. So last year, the City Commission did approve that 1-year extension. However, in the near term, it took Homestretch Nonprofit Housing Corporation some time to finalize their funding stack, and it was apparent that that was going to expire. So unfortunately, the ordinance gives us no other path forward other than to reapply. So that's why we had to go through the introduction last month. We're now holding the public hearing, and then upon recommendation whether to approve or deny from the Planning Commission, it will go to the City Commission for introduction and enactment as well. And just something to remember, that this is a conditional rezoning, so the Planning Commission has to take what has been presented as thumbs up or thumbs down. We can't add conditions to it because they've been voluntarily submitted by the applicant. So with that, I do know that we have the applicant here if you have any questions. And I know you will be holding a public hearing even though there is no one else here but the applicant. I will note for the record that you did receive 2 emails from the 2 neighbors that were in opposition to the approval.
Correct. Does anybody have anything to say before we open the public hearing?
I just appreciate the renderings that were forwarded on to us earlier today.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly help conceptualize what they're planning.
I think I was on the Planning Commission when this came through the first time, and I remember being excited about it, so I plan on being excited about it again.
Mm-hmm.
You can just open it
Okay.
and close
Yeah,
it.
to
All right.
bring up a specific point that was mentioned in some of the letters of opposition we received of parking. One, we have no requirement for a parking minimum, and even when we did, it was 1 parking space per residential unit. We have many small apartment complexes or, say, a single-family house that had been divided into multiple apartments, that if you go around town, you'll see that we, in many cases, are not meeting that one car per residential unit. If you look at the largest housing complex in our downtown, Riverview Terrace, at 150 Pine, they have 115 units with 43 parking spaces. So especially at affordable housing levels, there is more demand for housing than there is for housing plus car, so I don't see a fundamental problem in the number of parking spaces provided. I feel they'll be more than sufficient.
Anyone else? Well, I'm going to open up this public hearing. We have a representative from Homestretch. Would you like to say anything?
Not representing the public per se, but
No.
representing. I'm John Stimson with Homestretch Nonprofit Housing Corporation, and this is my second go-around of trying to accomplish an apartment complex at 1028 Carver Street, although that address is no longer valid. It's been changed to 1030 Carver, and then the back two buildings will be 135 and 140, I believe. That may be undone if the project doesn't go through, and it could revert back to a single-family residence, but we've gone through the process of having it reassessed or readdressed. So I know overall my presentation in the past has included diagrams, which you have in your packet, and it shows that we're being sensitive to the community and the look of the neighborhood by keeping the structures low in the front and stepping them up in the back so it blends in. And I know you've received my letter that asked for consideration of tonight, along with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority's contingent reservation. That contingency has been removed. We've met the financing requirements. So we are now on a path of a 2-year time frame to deliver these units as it's outlined in their letter that I included when I asked for this consideration of zoning amendment. And along with that, quite a few other aspects that we have to meet. But basically, we won't get that grant money until these units are placed in service and the project's really underway. So we had to get a bridge loan for that $485,000 grant, of which we are going to have to pay funds for. And I think what my take on the project now, if the zoning is approved, is more of a financial aspect. You know, without the zoning approval, without the pilot, and we do have a tax abatement on this for 6%, which does expire at the end of this year, and I will have to ask them to extend it. I think once we're in the ground, we'll be okay. But from a financing standpoint, it has been a heavy, heavy grind. But we have had benefits brought to us from the land bank. The land bank participated in the purchase of the property. They paid 50%. Homestretch paid 50%. Along with that, they have contributed an additional $200,000 if we can get the project underway. There was quite a bit of deed restriction put on the land for their contribution. So rightly so, we are meeting that criteria that they asked for. And then there's more capital. It goes down the list. A local organization, NMCAA, they've donated $60,000 for the project. Homestretch, incidentally, has $90,000 cash into the land, and I have a list of $63,000 worth of engineering survey pre-development costs. So we're already into it for $150,000. If the project did not go through, we could probably sell the land, but that's not our intent. So to paint a picture of even more financial commitment, if you will, our developer fee is only $150,000. So providing that we do get this project underway and in service to the community, we're going to break even. And that is the definition of a nonprofit, right? We break even on our projects. So I wanted to make those facts known, and then to support our mission and what we're doing, we're bound to the rent schedule that MISTA put forward, And to give the public an idea of what those rents are going to be, we have 3 one-bedroom apartments that will rent for $775 per month. And then we have the balance of 5 other apartments. There will be a duplex and then some 2-bedroom apartments in the back, and those rent for $1,150 per month. Those are low numbers, and those are only achieved with the grants that I spoke of, the tax abatement, and the willingness for a nonprofit to put the project together. So I can answer questions, but for me, it's a purely financial aspect. The zoning is of course necessary, the tax abatement's necessary, but we're committed to putting this project to fruition, and with your help, we'd like to carry through.
Thank you.
Sure.
Does anyone have any questions for John?
This isn't a zoning question, but how will people be, what's the formula that you're going to use for people to qualify for these units?
It'll be area median income not to exceed 80%.
Oh, okay.
Okay. The majority of the aggregate of units will probably be around 60, 70%. We have some 55, we have some 70. Generally, it'd be about 60% AMI.
Thank you.
And I'll point out to you, Linda, that even though we'll say you're income qualified, you could be below that income threshold. But if your income isn't sufficient to have 30% of your income go towards that housing expense, we are more than likely not going to rent you that unit.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Because we're trying to set people up for success. You may make under that amount, but and that could then mean you're making payments of 70, 80% of your income, or 60%, like a lot of folks will still want to be within that 30% area, or 30% of their gross income towards their housing expense, including utilities.
And I love that it seems to be, with the 2 bedrooms, that you could actually have families in there, correct?
Oh, up to 4-person household.
Right, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Would someone like to make a motion?
You may
Or
want
do
to
you-
close the public hearing first.
Oh, sorry. We're officially closing the public hearing.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll make a motion that the request by Homestretch Nonprofit Housing Corporation to conditionally rezone 1028 or whatever, Carver Street to R3 to provide 10 affordable residential units as previously approved in 2020 be recommended to the City Commission for approval.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Nay? Motion carries. John, thank you for your fortitude and for sticking with it.
Hopefully it goes forward.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you
John.
so much. Okay, so now we're going to move to Mr. Winter for a discussion on residential design standards.
Yeah, thank you. So this topic on the agenda tonight is not requiring any action of the Planning Commission, just an opportunity for a discussion. So this is precipitated from some of the public concerns that Commissioner Colbert, now see I get confused because she says Colbert and I say Colbert. So
It's
who-
Colbert.
It's
It's
Colbert.
Colbert.
It's Colbert. Stephen is Colbert.
Okay.
I
There's
go
no
by
L in
Colbert.
her name.
Well, it depends on if you're talking about the character or the person.
Yes. Yeah, so Commissioner Colbert reached out to staff, and we had a meeting with Susanna Tobin. She's the chair of the Historic District Commission, has been for, I think, 20-some years at this point. Another local planner named Brad, who works in private practice, and we talked about some of these. So I just want to walk through some of this, some of what you've been hearing at the Planning Commission level, if you've been paying attention to the City Commission level, some of the things that you've been hearing, and to clear up some maybe misunderstandings, provide context and things like that to some of these comments. So I want to preface this all by acknowledging we have this provision in our charter that simply states, among other things, that provided no ordinance respecting standards for the construction, repair, maintenance, improvement, occupancy, lease, or sale of housing other than hotels, motels, and that designed to be built, leased, or occupied by 3 or more families shall be essentially adopted unless first approved by a vote of the people. So in other words, we're limited in what we can do with 1 and 2 family structures. I've had the opportunity to talk to the city attorney about this. This came about from a proposed property maintenance ordinance that was being introduced at the time. People did not want their property regulated like that, so this charter amendment was adopted. It's interesting because, you know, on its face, the language says what it says. You can't, you know, regulate the construction of these things. However, we do have the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act that does allow us to do certain types of regulation, size of buildings, density, lot sizes, things of that nature, protecting environmental features. So you think of things like surface limits to protect runoff. Those are going to supersede this charter. But anything that we talk about today that the Planning Commission expressed interest in that we want to explore further will have to be reviewed with the city attorney. Admittedly, today she said it really hasn't been challenged by this. It's kind of always been sitting out there, but nothing has really ever posed a reason to test it, legally speaking.
So I have a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, could the people who wanted short-term rentals in our residential areas have used this to?
I would say no on that because there is case law that commercial short-term rentals are a commercial use essentially, and you can regulate the use within a district.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep.
I
So
thought we were on solid ground.
no, I
It's
think we
like,
are, yeah.
what?
No, this is more about the building itself and things like that. So,
And it certainly goes beyond maintenance, the way it's written. When it talks about construction and improvement, it goes way beyond maintenance,
mhm.
if that's what it was originally intended to be.
I would agree with that. So, again, I'm just putting that out there as something that needs to be considered through the conversations, more so what we as staff would probably do with the city attorney to get her recommendation on. So, all right, first topic I want to talk about is form-based code, because we hear about that a lot, that, you know, we can't adopt any of these ordinances.
Just on the last slide,
Mhm.
you talked about not wanting to go too far and risk getting it challenged. I suppose this might be putting the burden on members of the general public that would like clearer design standards, but could the city initiate a ballot proposal about a specific change to these?
They could, because this says it has to first be approved by the voters. And I brought this up to the city commission end of August when I gave a presentation, but it was more in the context of a rental inspection program, because people were bringing that up, but this would prohibit that, and that's why we don't have one for 1 and 2 families. So 3-family units on up, our department inspects, I think every 3 years or every 2 years, something like that, but we can't do it for 1 and 2 family. Not only can you put it to the vote of the people, a program to get adopted, the other option could be to put amending the charter to remove this provision to the vote of the people. All of that, though, as Commissioner Hershey and I were talking today, really is the purview of the city commission rather than the planning commission. But those are some of their options that they could have to consider. So, all right, first thing I want to talk about is form-based code, because it gets thrown around there a lot, and I don't know if a lot of people fully understand the concept of form-based code. So we just want to talk about it a little bit. So our modern form-based code emerged in 1982. So there was a development in Seaside, Florida, or in Florida called Seaside, that was laid out and designed by a husband and wife team, Andres Duani and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg. Very well-renowned planners, some of the initial leaders in new urbanism that you're probably familiar with in establishing that. They were able to design and regulate everything from scratch, because they were starting with a blank slate. And I want to emphasize that, because that's going to come up throughout the conversation. They weren't trying to integrate form-based code into an existing development pattern. They were creating essentially a new development pattern by the regulations in their form-based code. So this is the design that they came up with at Seaside. Has anyone ever heard of Seaside? Yeah. Has anyone ever visited Seaside? Yeah. I have not. So it's a very unique city. It's quite fascinating the way they have it laid out. Everything integrates. It definitely has the tenets of new urbanism throughout. Very walkable, mixed use, very minimal parking. You have public squares and areas and things like that. So from that rendering, this is the actual built environment that code was able to regulate and institute. And then for kind of like a little broader pulled back view, you can see it there nestled within the coast there of Florida. So to kind of compare that a little bit, most people are used to what we call conventional zoning or Euclidean zoning. It has nothing to do with geometry, but Euclid, Ohio, where the first test case that went before the Supreme Court, which determined that yes, governments can in fact regulate the use of land originated. So conventional zoning focuses more on the uses and their separation. And this was at a time when industry was very dirty. So we wanted to make sure industry and residential were separated. And from that came separations of commercial and office. And frankly, a lot of our suburban development pattern where you can't live where you work and things like that, and you start to separate that. So it can and often does include design guidelines. It often includes some arbitrary standards, like how many dwelling units per acre, or what the floor area ratio for the lot can be, which is kind of an archaic design technique, or even parking requirements. I can promise you there's no science to parking requirements. It's a very arbitrary standard. Form-based code, on the other hand, focuses more on the built results or the form of the structures and less on their uses and their separation. So it supports the integration or the mixing of uses, focusing more on the box rather than what's going on inside of it. The goal there is to have predictable built development pattern, but it's not necessarily design standards that a lot of people, I think of when they say form-based code. It can have that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But with form-based code, the real emphasis is on what we call the public realm. So that space from building facade to building facade on the other side of the street, which includes public land, which is the right-of-way, as well as the private land and the facade, which is private. But how do those buildings and the amenities around it contribute to the feel of that public realm? So that's the emphasis on form-based code. So there's 5 main tenets of form-based code. So it's not just something you can simply add into your zoning ordinance. It's a whole new way of zoning. So the first is a regulating plan, which most people would think of that similar to a zoning map. So these are the different kind of categories or areas where we have different form patterns allowed. You have your public standards, so that which contributes to the public realm. Your building standards, which are more related to the shape and the form of the structure. How things get approved. The whole idea about form-based code, since it's supposed to be more predictable, is most things are approved by right, because you're looking at the building itself. If you meet all those, we've sacrificed caring about the rest to focus on the building, so we can approve you quickly based on those standards. And of course, a section on definition. So a lot like any other zoning ordinance. They often include additional elements, such as architectural standards. These almost exclusively apply to the commercial buildings, not necessarily single-family homes, but they can at times, but primarily you see those for commercial buildings. Landscaping standards, signage standards, environment resource standards, such as maybe stormwater management or setbacks from wetlands, and then annotation, which is usually a set of pictures or diagrams and text descriptions of what the language of the code actually means. And I just want to point out that conventional zoning, like kind of more what we have, includes a lot of this too. We have landscaping standards for the public realm. Outside of the R1 and R2, we do have some architectural standards. That's another conversation if those need to be revisited or revised at any point. We regulate signage, we regulate stormwater runoff and things like that. And of course, we do have definitions as well. So what I want to talk about next is what we call a hybrid approach, which actually is what we have here in Traverse City more so than a conventional zoning ordinance. So this blends components of conventional and form-based code zoning together. So form-based code often performs, I want to point this out, poorly in places with existing development. I mentioned that earlier because you already have development that has occurred over 100, 150 years in our city. So you have all different types of forms. So then to suddenly prescribe to that area one set of form necessarily, you end up creating a lot of nonconformities. That can bring into some legal questions on how you implement that. Just for context, Chief Tuller brought it up in staff today, and some of you may remember, but the Planning Commission did explore form-based code for 8th Street at one point. They had a whole subcommittee working on it and ultimately abandoned the idea because, again, it is a challenge to integrate that into an existing development pattern. Were either of you on
He
that?
was.
Chief was, yeah. So I can tell you firsthand, locally, 2 communities where they have tried to do this and they really struggled. So in 2014 or 2015, Acme Township adopted form-based code for a large chunk of the township. And full-blown, not hybrid, but like they had the regulating plan, the text and the annotation. It was really exciting at the time. It became extremely challenging to actually implement because a lot of what was happening is you had an existing building. Well, that building doesn't meet the standards. Well, they are going to build an addition. Well, how do you incorporate all these new standards into that part that's an addition without looking wonky from what already exists in the building and so on and so forth. So in 2020, 2021, they rewrote their zoning ordinance and they got rid of the full-blown form-based code and integrated the hybrid approach. So Village of Sutton's Bay, similar story. They adopted form-based code and they completely repealed it from the ordinance altogether, specifically because of how poorly it was working in the single-family residential districts. So just sharing some of the lived experiences by some of our neighbors here.
Were you the planner in Acme when that was going on?
Yeah. Yeah, I started
Great job.
right after it. And I rewrote the ordinance for them at the time, too. So, again, form-based code, as I mentioned with Seaside, it really does work best with greenfield development, or if you have a built environment where you have a tremendous amount of blight, where you know it's going to be complete redevelopment occurring. So one example that we actually have here in Traverse City is Morgan Farms. Morgan Farms has like a form-based code approach in that they have the pattern book. Not saying it's without its challenges, those of us that have administered it, but that's an example of taking a greenfield and being able to start from scratch and really laying out all those standards in a more harmonious way than incorporating it. So again, from my experience, hybrid works very well with the established built environments like what we have here in Traverse. So with that, specifically speaking to our R1 and R2 districts, I'd like to talk to you about some of our existing form elements that we already have in our zoning ordinance. So we recognize that single-family and two-family homes are not anything that the Planning Commission reviews and approves. So you probably don't spend a lot of time on those standards. And as planning commissioners, if you don't spend a lot of time on those standards, it's likely the general public doesn't either. So they may not know what we look at when we go through this. So some of the tenets of form-based code that we have in our current zoning ordinance, Mitch hit on the first one on the last agenda item. We don't have any parking requirements for downtown or residential uses. So that is very much a form-based code element. In fact, when we do have parking requirements, they're quite minimal compared to other communities. And in many cases, specifically retail, office, medical, and financial, we have parking maximums. So we're limiting the form of the parking lot. We're not letting people build that massive sea of asphalt just for that one day a year on Black Friday or something like that. We do not have density limits for residential uses outside the R1 and the R2, where we limit it to one family or two family. Again, going back to the idea that we're going to regulate the box, you can figure out how many units and what unit mix is most appropriate for within that box. As I mentioned earlier, we do have some commercial design standards that contribute to the public realm. So we say like downtown, you have to have brick or masonry exterior facade on the street facing. We have minimal window requirements on the first floor. We require that our windows be recessed 4 inches so you get shadow lines, vertical and horizontal modulation to buildings so that we're breaking up facades. We have entrance requirements, in some cases like a minimum if you have a very large building of every like 90 feet so that it's not just one entrance into other word monolithic structure. And we also have minimum building width. So a lot of our lots, even when we say you have no side yard setback, a lot of our districts say you must occupy at least 80% of the width of the lot so that you're filling it and you're contributing to that public realm by building in that kind of wall that creates the outdoor living room, if you will. The next one I want to talk about is front setback. So in the R1A, it's 25 feet, but you can go beyond that. R1A is kind of like base of the peninsula. It's up on top of the hill by the golf course where you have larger lots, more recently developed. Your streets there don't really have sidewalks. It's a different type of development pattern. So there's more flexibility added there. But the majority of R1 is R1B. And so what we do is we regulate that the front setback has to be, your building has to sit within plus or minus 4 feet of the block average. So what we do is we manage this document that has every block in the city and what the average is along each one. And that's where you have to place your building. And what that does is it takes the nuance of every block's context into effect, but keeps the form of each building somewhat similar along that stretch. A couple other ones, in the Boardman and Central Historic Districts, in keeping with form, we do not allow attached garages. They have to be accessed off the alley, and you have to maintain a minimum of 30 feet of yard space between the two. So therefore, you're keeping that form spacing within there. So what we're trying to do is, protect what we have here when you go down the street. You have these porches that sit relatively similar to each other. The porches face the public right-of-way. That's, again, that public realm feeling, eyes on the street. We have sidewalks, we have street trees, all those elements worked in there. Again, another picture. And in some cases, we can see here, they're probably 8 feet back, some of those steps starting. But on other blocks, that block average is even greater, so it sits back even further. So that's one nice thing, is taking into account every block's own character and working within it.
And since a lot of those houses were built far in advance of our current zoning code, was there an effort to line up the houses, or don't you know?
I don't know for certain, but
Or were there a pre-zoning rule about how far back a house had to be?
nothing before 43, yeah, that I'm aware of. But to that point, here's a more recent block, if you will. So this is 13th Street. The road that you see on the right is Wadsworth, so the stadium's on the other side of the street here. So the highlighted block, that house was built in 2016. So if you look here, you can see how the setback is very similar to the average setback of those houses that share that block with it. Now, when we calculate average setback, we do not count the outliers like this, because that would skew the average dramatically. So what we do is we take the general placing of the blocks, and this is not a primary house. This is a non-conforming accessory structure on a separate lot.
Wait a minute,
So
which one are we looking at?
this one?
Am I seeing an arrow? Are you talking about the one in the blue box?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is my, I'm
Your-
sorry, my cursor's not on
Yeah,
the
your
screen.
cursor's not working.
I can see it on
There
mine.
it is.
Yeah, there it is.
Wait,
It was there.
it was there.
Oh,
There
go.
you know what it is? I'm in presentation mode, so I have 2 different screens.
Okay,
I have it on the other one.
can you
Okay.
say that again then?
So if you look right here, thank you. Who knows how many things I'm pointing at that you guys can't see. So right here, we can see the established front setback of this single-family home built in 2016. If you look and you were to draw a line, it's fairly consistent with the rest of the houses on the block, with the exception of this house that sits way far back. But when they calculated block average for this document, if there was an outlier like this, again, they exempted it from the calculation because it would have thrown everything off from what the primary
Was
existing.
that originally a garage location for the house next to it, similar to the house and garage situation right next to the blue box?
I can't say for certain. I mean, looking at that, because I'm familiar with this, living around the corner, this is a house. It doesn't look like a garage, like it was converted.
Yeah.
It just was pushed way far back. And that could have preempted the zoning that requires
Yeah,
this.
I'm not saying that it was a garage that was converted. I'm saying that there might have been a garage there, and then the property owner decided, okay, I have 2 parcels, I'll split them into 2 parcels and build this as a second house.
And that's a possibility, yeah. Couldn't say for certain, though. So here's another example. So this is a block of 16th between Veterans Drive and Pine Street, and there's 2 newer houses. This one was built in 2008, and this one was just built last year. But again, even with the houses that are in some cases 80 years older than these, they all maintain a very similar front position, and that's intentional. We want to do that. We give a little flexibility there, but again, mimic there. All right, couple other things. As far as form elements, we'll talk about how they apply to accessory buildings. So we have a few standards when ADUs were first allowed that applied to accessory buildings. So an ADU is an accessory building. But when people started building these, at the time, most accessory buildings were a shed or a garage. Okay, so now we're starting to build living quarters as accessories too. Since we didn't have a lot of standards at first, and I think Linda lived this a few times, some really weird, out of scale ADUs were built, and some were completely different than the design of the principal building altogether. So here's a not so great example. So on the right, you have the 1-story principal structure, and on the left, you have a very out of scale 2-story garage with an ADU above. So this caught the attention of some people. That was brought to the Planning Commission, as well as this one. So if you look at this one here, in the background, you can see the principal house. It has a pretty standard, what looks to be a 12-12 pitch roof. It's a tan color. Then we have this very vibrant orange and yellow structure with a curved roof to it. Again, no harmony between the
But
form
we
of
don't
those
regulate
two
paint
structures.
colors.
Nope, we don't regulate paint colors. But, you know, it's clear that I could see why some individuals were concerned with the mismatch of the form of these two structures. So with that, the Planning Commission adopted some amendments to the accessory buildings. So the max height can only be 25 feet or the height of the principal building, whichever is left. So if you have a maxed out 35-foot tall principal building, your ADU can only be 25 feet. However, if your principal building is only 15 feet, your ADU can only be 15 feet, or your accessory building for that matter. And we run into that a lot, where people have a single-story home and they want to build that two-story garage with ADU above, and they can't do it. So they have to either keep it all on one floor or forego one of those uses. We also limit the floor area of the ADU. It cannot be bigger than 75% of the gross floor area of the principal building. And when we say gross floor area, that means all floors. So if it's 2 stories, you count the area of both floors there. We do, however, allow a minimum of 484 square feet for an accessory building, because that's the standard size of a 2-car garage. So you happen to have a 600 square foot house, you could still have a 2-car garage. It'd be a little more than 75%, but I think that's a nice way to meet in the middle. So for instance, 2,000 square foot principal building means you can have 1,500 square feet worth of accessory building. 1,000 square foot principal building, you can get 750 square feet accessory building. We're reviewing plans this week where someone wanted to build an ADU and they simply didn't have enough house for the size of the ADU that they were building. The proportions were off.
Can you go back to that? Say I have 2,000 square feet, but I have a 2-story house, but I want to build an ADU that's 1,500 on one floor. Is that a go? I have a nice big lot.
Yes, yes.
That would work?
Because it's gross, yep. Yep.
Okay. So it's not the footprint.
Nope, it's gross floor, yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because the reality is most of our lots are pretty small. You know, it was interesting, and this will come into conversation a little bit later, because I was talking with assessing, and this has to go with the lot widths and whether they get combinations to build big houses, and it doesn't really happen. And he's, you know, the assessors around here all talk, they're all part of the same county equalization. And he's like, compared to the townships around here in the city, we actually have really small houses, because we don't have the large lots to really expand on and things like that.
So
And the floor area includes any concrete pad used for car storage or other stuff?
Within the structure.
Yes.
Within the structure. And there's nuance to it, like stairwells. We only count one floor that the stairwell takes up, you know,
Yeah.
just to kind of make it more fair. And we also have, we don't count.
But if there was an external staircase, that wouldn't count.
No. And we don't count that portion, let's say the ceiling is sloped below 6 feet, because you can't stand underneath it. You can't really, you might push a dresser up there, but you're not going to occupy it.
So I think Jim and I were both here when these corrections got made. Are you satisfied with these? Is this?
I mean, it definitely gives us teeth, and
Yeah.
some of the ones that I've seen out there, I think, are much better than what I showed just a little bit ago in
Yeah.
those pictures. And we're able to now have something to tell people, like, no, you can't. You got to turn that down, or you got to cut this back in size, or something like that. So, but before, without the regulations, we didn't have much to hang a hat on.
And this is only for an ADU that is a fully separate building. If you have an attached ADU, it doesn't have to.
Correct. Then the standards of the principal building come into play and stuff. So, little more with ADUs. The max of the ADU itself, the living component of an accessory building, can't be more than 800 square feet. So just a couple examples, going back to that one, if you had a 2,000 square foot principal building, 75% of that is 1,500 square feet. Well, if you maxed out 800 square feet for the ADU, you're only left with 700 square feet for, say, the garage or another use. So we see people making those choices sometimes because they want the garage on the first floor. You're typically not going to have the smaller story on the first floor and a bigger. So a lot of times you kind of mess around with those numbers a little bit. Same thing, if you have a 1,000 square foot principal building, 75% is only going to afford you 750 square feet of allowed accessory structure. So even though the max of an ADU is 800 square feet, due to the proportion of your principal structure, you can only get 750. So if you have a smaller house, your accessory building ends up being smaller. So,
Unless you tear down your existing house or otherwise build a larger existing house first.
yep, and then that changes all the math to it. So, so again, we have some flexibility in the ratio between the ADU and the other accessory uses. You know, really comes down to what people they need and what their preference is. Maybe the garage component is what is their priority, and they want that to be the greater of the distribution of allowed accessory space. They also included some design components, so any accessory structure, whether it's a shed or ADU or garage that's over 200 square feet, it has to have be substantially similar in design to the principal structure. So siding material, roof pitch is something that we look at, things like that. And we also want to point out that any accessory building that requires a permit, so over 200 square feet from the building construction code office, has to get Historic District Commission approval as well. So they're looking at it from an architectural standpoint, and the Boardman and Central Neighbor Historic Districts.
So if your house has a pitched roof, your accessory dwelling could not have a flat roof? right?
No, nope. And if it has a pitched roof, it needs to essentially have the same
same
pitched
pitch.
roof. Yep. Yep. And so with these standards in place, the outcomes have been much more predictable and, again, I'd say harmonious. So here we have an example. This is on Cass Street, Cass and 9th, I think the second house in. Sorry, with the foliage, you can't see, but you can tell, same color, same type of lap siding, same roof pitch. Waterfront properties, we allowed the accessory structures to be roadside, but again, we can see here that we have the same type of like shingling, siding that you have in the background here, same type of fascia board, sorry, thank you, and roof pitch, same colored material.
Do the windows have to match?
You know, we try to get them similar. You know, that's where that substantially similar in design part comes in, where we kind of work with them. And frankly, most people want them to match, since we're already moving you towards a match in the structure. It hasn't really been much of a problem. Here's another one where we have the ADU on the left and then the principal structure on the right. Again, roof pitch, fairly similar. We do have this kind of gingerbread molding here. Same vents up in the corner up there, white trim throughout. And we use the same thing when it comes to flat roof structures. So on the left, you have the ADU. On the right, you have the principal structure. Here you have a case where they're both about the same height, because it's 2 stories, which is typically about 25 feet. So the accessory structure's roughly equivalent, which is the max it can be. But you can see that they work in that same kind of wood texture, unique window placements and things like that, and
Is
colors.
that on 10th?
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so now we'll talk about a case study, 124 South Oak Street. No, is it North Oak Street?
Yes, it's north.
Because this one gets referenced a lot.
Yes.
So, you know, detached accessory buildings, and this was built, they were allowed to be connected by a breezeway. Again, somewhat limited in the parameters of those breezeways. So the owner ran a connected breezeway the entire height of the house to the back. What further impacted this one is that they did max out other dimensional standards, such as height, width of the building with the side setbacks and all that, impervious surfaces and things of that nature. That did create a massing in a scale that was out of context with the homes surrounding it. So if you're not used to it, it's a very modern looking structure. It does have a flat roof, has a lot of unique textures and elements to it, a lot of glass. But you can see right here with the house to the right, based on the size of the house, or sorry, the left, that it is quite a bit out of scale compared to what was built around it. A lot of this, and this shows it well with that long wall going back, that's representing that connected breezeway. So just a couple other perspectives from the rear and stuff like that. So solution, Planning Commission amended that section and put a little greater teeth in the ordinance and limited breezeways. First of all, they're prohibited in the Boardman and Central District. They're only allowed now on corner lots. This here is an interior lot, so you couldn't even have an attached garage in that case. The maximum that a breezeway connecting the accessory building to the principal building could be is 10 feet long, 15 feet tall, and it can't take up more than 100 square feet of area. So this could not be built today. This happened in a previous time, and the standards have changed, and that level of massing and height connecting the accessory building to the principal is no longer permitted. All right, so I want to just talk at a high level about design standards. Now we've talked about form-based code, we've talked about some of these standards we've done to regulate the form of the building, but when it comes to design standards, or what some people might think of as architectural standards, there are some potential charter limitations, as we mentioned at the onset of this. Outside of the established historic districts, most neighborhoods really struggle to exhibit a dominant design or architecture. That's, again, going back to the fact that most of our neighborhoods have been built out over the period of 100, 150 years. So different architectural standards existed, different construction methods existed throughout those time periods. Therefore, different building structures occupy those neighborhoods. So outside of those historic districts, it's hard to really establish what design would be the one that needs to be emulated or reflected in the code. And that's one of the challenges of, say, a public neighborhood versus a subdivision with an HOA that can have bylaws that's, again, starting from a greenfield perspective and can regulate all of it, all being constructed at the same time. So I live in a part of the city off of 16th Street where a road was put in the early 1980s, and all the houses were put in within 2 years of each other. It goes up a hill. Given the time period, they're all split levels. But that's, again, 2 blocks that were built at one set time, not over a long period. So as I've been hearing these conversations.
And I wouldn't be surprised if 50 years from now, when those property owners have time to put on additions or do renovations, you see a little more heterogeneity in that 2-block span.
We're starting to as well. So I'm on Arnold Court, and then 17th also has a lot of split levels. They seem to work well. I'm not an architect, but when you have homes built into a grade, they seem to fit nice in that. And you got the hill going up right there. And we're starting to see people do that, add more character and like architecture. They're very architecturally boring houses. I just stare at this blank wall all the time of ours, but it's what we could get ourselves into when we move back. So as these conversations have been going on, I've been trying to be more aware. So as I've been walking through neighborhoods, I've been noting the variety. So I did this yesterday and added some more slides that aren't in your packet because I did it yesterday after it went out. But this was one block of 15th Street that I walked on. And so just to visually show you some of the diversity. So starting there, that was the first house in on the block, which I will note is a duplex in the R1 district next to this house. So which one would we want to build design standards to reflect? And then as you keep going, we got now a single story with a hipped roof or a pitched roof, yet another duplex. There is actually a unique section in the middle of the block where there's a lot of variations of this style house. We got ones with covered porches, again, low slung, different sizes. Then you have houses that start from a different time period, it would seem, with the character there. This one has the one part of the roof running much longer with the eave than the other side, which across the street, that house is somewhat similar, and both of them incorporate the entryway. This one's actually a triplex right there that one of our city engineers lived in with his wife at one period.
That would have been a great example in our original slideshow, that's a triplex. Who would ever know that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will just say, quick side note, does anybody know Marty McLeod?
Yep.
Yep, so she's on the Historic District Commission. She wrote a book about like Traverse City's Old South Side. It's about Old Town. And it's very, very nice if you ever read it. But she did note, we see all these onesies and twosies, as she called them. It was very common for people to be like, oh, here's my architectural plans. You can build the same house now. And so you see a lot of that reflected. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's what happened here, because we got this house, and then across the street we have this one, and then somewhat similar.
Sean, not to interrupt, but.
No, please.
She just put a book out on Central Neighborhood about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, did she? A new one?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I'll have
Wait,
to check
what?
that out.
Yeah.
They're lighthearted reads too, very informative, but she's got a great personality. So here's where another one of our city engineers live. It seems to be the block for that. But, you take some of the houses I've shown you before, and this is on the same block as well, Then you got other houses, and some are pushed back. So again, I just went down, took a walk, started snapping some pictures. And that's the visual reality of trying to incorporate design or architectural standards into a built environment. So next one, and this is a question that we'd like feedback on from you guys on this, is roof type and height. And this kind of goes back to the 124 Oak Street. So R1A and R1B, and as well as R2, the max building height is 35 feet. And it's been that since 1943. So that's as tall as people could build. Different roof types have different ways of measuring their height. So for instance, a flat top roof or a flat roof, we measure from the grade to the roof deck. If it's a pitched roof, most people think on a pitched roof, we measure to the ridge. We actually measure to the halfway point between the ridge and the eave. That's how you establish the height of a pitched roof. So the question really is, should flat roofs have a lower maximum building height, say 25 feet, than pitched roofs to prevent them from feeling out of scale? So just to kind of walk through an example, and you've seen this in your packet, for the R1B, and this was before any changes that were adopted yesterday, had a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet, a max height of 35, and a max impervious surface of 45%. So the examples you're going to see are all modeled to scale. They're a typical city lot, which is 50 by 165, so 8,250 square feet. These structures are 35 feet, both the flat and gable roof, using the different measuring methods that we have for each roof type. And the impervious surface in these two examples is 43.4%. And you can see how we were able to break those down for you, noting that, yeah, all that stuff. So when you look at it, a lot of people think that a flat roof would have much greater massing than a pitched roof. And that is only true if the flat roof structure is maxed out at 35 and the structures next to it aren't. Because if you have a pitched roof maxed out at 35 feet, that ridge is always going to be taller than the flat roof because you're only measuring at the halfway point between the eave and the ridge. So just going to keep that in mind there. So when we look here, this is a flat roof building again, no just massing shown here. So you'd measure from the ground up, which is 35 feet. So with the pitched roof, the vertical wall is 25 feet, and you're going to go halfway between the eave and the ridge, which in this model is scaled at 10 feet, so that's 35 feet. So the pitched roof, I keep wanting to say hip, pitched roof is going to be taller than the flat roof when maxed out. And if you lower the flat roof to 25 feet, it drops that even further. And so it's probably this perspective that gives you that feel the greatest of how they look next to each other. And then this isometric from the left view. Then from the street, again, this is probably another great perspective when you sit there and look at the street. If maxed out, yes, the pitched roof is going to be taller than the flat one. Mitch?
Yes, considering that this is looking at what could be maxed out, and often you might have an entire block of houses, none of which come close to being maxed out, even though this is not the direction I'd like to go. Could there be, and it would make it more complicated for writing and enforcing, some standard similar to the front setback of making it, I wouldn't say it has to be no more than the median of the existing height, but maybe no more than 5 or 10 feet or something, so that if zoning says that, yes, you can put a 35-foot building here, but there's nothing taller than 20 feet on the block already, then that 35-foot would look out of character.
And that's a great question, and that's something that I had a discussion Friday with Susanna Tobin about, you know. My concern there would be you're letting the way other people develop their property determine your developmental rights. So let's say I have a piece of property where, for one reason or another, 50 years ago when most of the houses around me were built, they were built one-story ranches. And because of the average on the block, I can only build a house 12 feet tall. But Laura, sorry. We always get that mixed up. That's why we just started calling her Brooke in the office recently, because Dave thinks she looks like Brooke Shields.
Oh, my God.
You brought
Digging.
A young Brooke
A young,
Shields,
yes,
not
yes.
like she looks now.
Thank you, Linda.
Yeah.
That's something that Dave didn't say. And
It's unfortunate, but.
So, point being is if Laura lived across the street and for one reason or another, most of the houses were built 2 stories, now she has greater development rights in the same district just because of how others developed their property in the past. So that would be my concern. It's a good question.
Yeah, and I'd like as I said, this wouldn't be the direction I'd want to go. I want to be able to develop houses higher within a reasonable building envelope. And that doesn't directly interfere with the overall, hey, having nice grassy lawns, that having all the rest of your houses be set back 15 feet from the sidewalk, but then your house is set back 3 feet would.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So, and this would make it trickier to write, but you wouldn't want to use a median. You'd want to have some fixed amount higher than that, and then as more development happened, it would incrementally trend upward, but I don't know how implementable that would be.
Yeah, it's definitely not without its challenges, because we talked about that with Dave. Linda was in on that meeting. Measuring the block average setback is a lot easier because it's two-dimensional. Now to go and establish the block average height of all the different rooftops,
When you have different roof pitches.
exactly, that becomes very challenging. But again, nothing's impossible with enough resources. So
John, I got a quick question.
yeah,
Are mansard roofs considered? I mean, this is just a gable versus a flat roof. I mean,
Yep.
there's certainly square footage implications if I want to build a mansard roof.
correct. So mansard roofs we measure like a flat roof to the top of the deck of the mansard.
Can you explain to me what a mansard roof is?
I'll let David explain because he'll use the right words and I'll just talk
I
with my
meant to look
hands.
it up, and I
People
didn't.
don't use those very often anymore, though, do they?
Here, I can pull it up real
I can only
quick.
draw it. Like,
Okay.
if it had a, like a 30-degree angle here, you see a lot of old
Yeah.
townhomes like that, where, yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay,
So you're
Okay.
getting 90% of the square footage
okay.
tucked in a,
It became
additional
popular
story.
in Paris
Yeah, that's
as a way of getting an additional floor of building height
Because you were
without,
taxed by story.
yes.
Yes, and since this was within the roof, it didn't count.
Interesting, and of course you know that, I love that. Question,
Mm-hmm.
when we established these, the 35-foot, were we thinking of a 2-story building or a 3-story building, do you think?
Specifically, the 1943 code, when it was established, says 2.5 stories.
So that's the little slanted room, bedroom up
Mhm.
on the top,
Or a lifted basement. So I'll show some
right?
examples, some visuals on that.
But now with a 35-foot flat roof house, you could get 3 stories.
Yes, where well, yeah, more than likely, because typically 15, 10, 10 is what
Yeah.
people usually look at.
Yeah, and maybe that's where, I mean, there was a lot of concern expressed about, I mean, you heard, you heard it, we've heard it for 7 months, so, there was a lot of concern about that, and maybe that is visually what's troubling to people, the 2-story versus 3-story.
Mm-hmm.
I just, personally, I think a flat roof house lower than the other house looked weird to me. I don't know, it looked more out of scale than this does to me.
Yeah.
So,
But
And as I go through some of these slides here again, it's challenging because it all comes down to context, right? Like some of those homes on 6th Street would look very, very out of context in my neighborhood, but given the ones in the mass around them and what they were built, they don't, they blend. And so, yeah, I'm happy to show you some examples for, kind of talking through some of this. So I think you kind of get the idea here, and you had these in your packet and go through how the different roof types, if maxed out, would compare to one another.
and is the concern of the flat roof the roof and the scale, or is it that it looks like a box? What is
No,
the
It's the
concern?
mass.
no, I think it's the mass, yeah,
Mhm.
it's the mass.
So again, since 1943, 35-foot top. Most houses, though, were built at 2 stories. That seemed to be the standard. So utilizing 35 feet can feel out of scale compared to those that are at 25 feet, regardless of roof type. That's what I'm going to show here in a second. So it depends how the neighboring property owners have developed their properties. So here on Union, we have 2 houses. They're both quite large, but looking at them side by side, their scale somewhat complements each other. And again, they have pitched roofs and things like that. However, when these homes were built, I think like 2015 and 2018, if you look at them compared to the roofs of the smaller structures that were there beforehand, they do seem out of scale. But I hadn't heard a lot of complaints about this one, so to your question, like a lot of the scaling does come from flat roofs that we hear. And if you look at the one on the other side of the black house, it's again similar. Here's one that was built in 2008 on 16th Street. It is 2.5 stories. It's got a pitch roof, and this is a bad time of year because of the foliage to capture these photos. I apologize. This one was lifted up a little higher, and I think that was intentional because this sits at the opposite end of a T intersection. So the living room of this house is right here. So by lifting it up a little bit, the headlights are not shining directly into the living room, but the basement space. So when you look at the scale of this house, it seems like a reasonable scale, but compared to the house to the left, that is 1 story with a low pitch roof, it does seem out of scale. So again, it's hard to manage massing without really taking into account the context of all those houses around it. Another example of this, I don't think most people would say that's a large, massive house that belongs in Birmingham, right? But when you look at it compared to the single-story house next to it, it is much bigger. So, you know, which context gets to decide how the neighborhood gets developed. And sometimes it's perspective. So here we're looking at it with the taller house in the foreground. The difference in scale and massing doesn't seem as sharp of a contrast when you keep the smaller house in the foreground, you know, so it's all that kind of perspective stuff. So that said, those are just some thoughts on lot width that we've explored since, you know, Linda and I and Dave and Susanna and Brad all met a while back. And I apologize, I was going to bring this to you in September, but had to step out of town for a little bit for some things. So now we're just getting to it. So ultimately, the direction that we'd like to hear from the Planning Commission is regulating roof height, specifically more so flat roofs, differently than pitch roofs, something that the Planning Commission at this time wants to further explore. Is this where we should invest our resources at the time?
I think, given real estate market forces, I think it's something we should talk about, especially if we're trying to increase density and, you know, number of units per acre or per property. I think now is a good time as any. And you mentioned Birmingham, you know, a lot of inner ring suburbs in a lot of older cities, you know, not to pick on Oak Street, but those are templates for what succeeds them. Like if you go to Chicago, inner ring neighborhoods in Chicago, they're all those buildings, whereby, you know, they knocked over a single-story shotgun like the one on the right there for that building type. And that was in the name of density and market forces.
So is it primarily focusing the change on the flat roofs to keep that perceived massing reduced?
I don't see that because of what you just showed us. I mean, you have gabled roofs that are different heights than the ones next door. You know, and what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at all what you're presenting here is what we've been talking about for the last year and a half is housing variety. This is housing variety. I don't see how you can, what you said at the beginning, how can you regulate to the point that somebody is bound by something that was built 80 or 100 years ago? That doesn't make sense to me. And to your point, it may not go with what the market needs. So,
And I can say that there is something of a disconnect by the continued existence of houses like 124 Oak Street, that we do have a currently different measure for a pitched roof versus flat roof that was intended to ameliorate the issues of massing that's out of scale with your neighborhood character. Well, on its face, I would think that going more in that direction would be good, and then we could ensure that other new development matches its immediate surroundings a bit better. I'm worried that to do that right, especially if we're not trying to overly limit what can get built where, would require investing significant amount of staff time and either on a neighborhood by neighborhood or even more granular basis, setting different standards for different parts of town in a way that is not best practices for planning and would make our planning and zoning more cumbersome and burdensome to enforce. While it may result in, at least for new builds or redevelopments, something that people could like aesthetically, it could also end up hampering stuff or canceling a particular new house that neighbors could think is okay, and then forcing a type of development that doesn't look like what the neighbors might want.
How does regulating that, and we can do that with the current charter?
Well, I talked to the city attorney today, and if the planning commission wanted to explore some of these regulations, it's something we would have her look through that lens with.
And wouldn't it have to be for every single potential thing that could come up?
To be determined. It's a great area, as she says. It's never been challenged to set a precedent as to like where's the line is that, because the question came up when her and I were talking. ADUs, right? They're part of a single-family home, but we're saying they have to have the same design element. Specifically in that charter language, it talked about the occupancy of it, but we require owner occupancy. So, but no one's challenged it.
So help me walk through this. If we leave it the way it is, you can build a 35-foot flat-roofed house in the front, and you could build a 25-foot flat roof place in the back. Is that correct?
Correct.
If the back is treated as an ADU, if it's a second house on a lot that's large enough, then it could be built 35 feet.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
The ADU could be 35 feet?
No, if it's a second house.
Oh, if it's a second
under
house.
what we
Is that what
passed
you were saying
yesterday.
last night? I think it was.
Is an opportunity through creation of a site condo to
Right.
create something that bypasses ADU standards by treating it as a second house.
I mean, this is just how I feel, because I've lived in almost my entire life in neighborhoods like these. And I always loved walking through these neighborhoods to say, oh, look at that cute house that they built in the 1940s, and then, oh, well, there's that mid-century modern of the 1960s, and then I think it just brings interest and historical interest and character to have all these different things. And I really, in hearing all the comments from the public, I don't think, other than Oak Street, I don't think this is the issue. I think the issue is more the look, not just the height or the type of roof, but the look of the house. Are you going to put in the middle of charming-looking houses, no matter what their height is, a box, a metal box? Are you going to do that? That's what I think they're more worried about, from what the comments I've heard, than the height of a flat roof versus a gable roof. I think it's more the actual look that they're worried about, and that then goes back to the charter amendment again. You can't really dictate a look.
I tried to indicate this in the forum piece that I wrote the other day. I think one of the things that people are angry about is that people are coming to town with so much cash in their pocket that they can build to the max anything that's in our ordinances. And so people who live in modest homes and always have in a modest neighborhood suddenly find themselves with a neighboring house that has maxed out all of our things. And so I think it's being expressed as that doesn't fit right. I think it's deeper than that. I think it's a class issue as well. And I think we're going to see more of that, because more and more of our properties in our neighborhoods are being bought up by people who will, build to the max.
But the problem is
And we can't fix that.
They're within the law. They're
Exactly.
within-
They're within the law. They bring their lawyer, and they're within the law. And
I don't
so
think there's a
that's
lot
what
we
I
can
think
do
some of
about
the
that.
anger and frustration is on people's, that's, after months and months of listening, I hear a lot of that, I think. Steve Nance lives on Webster Street, and he's had an empty lot next to him for all the time he's been on that house. And somebody just bought up that lot, is building a house to the max, next to them. that's a change in the quality of your life. It's not was never your lot. You know, it was always there, but when it happens, it's like, oh, geez. And I think that's what we're hearing as well. I think there's a lot of that. Friends of ours built their dream house on Lake Skagamog, and now somebody's come in and built a house next to it the size of Costco. I mean, it's totally changed the quality of their life. There are security lights on night and day. And again, could zoning have fixed that? I don't know, but I don't think so. But that was part of the fear that came up in that meeting too. How do we prevent people from buying up 3 lots and creating more estates in town? That worries me more than anything. Because I live near I live near an estate. Yeah, I live near an estate, and I find that more troubling than any of these other things. But that's my bias, right? So currently, you are saying we measure 35 feet to the middle of the gable and 35 feet to the flat of the roof.
Mhm.
And you're all fine with that. So the other thing that comes to my mind when I hear this, and I missed you last night because there were times when questions were being asked that I didn't have an answer for, and she didn't have an answer for, and was pointing to various people who might have had the answer and didn't. I think it's going to be really important as we try to reestablish connections with a swath of the community that is now alienated, is the education piece. And if we use Colleen for that, or whatever, with the pictures, with the explanation, I think when you sit down and have coffee with people one-on-one, you hear what the fear is, you you unpack it, and then with a piece of education, that doesn't seem right. That can happen. But right now, the silos are so tight that we're going to have to slowly pick away at that. If it's
I agree with the education because there's some very interesting things that were presented
Absolutely.
here tonight that most people don't know.
The city commission doesn't know it.
Right.
The city commission should hear these things. I mean, but not just us. I mean, after being hammered for 7 months, last night there was a city commissioner who didn't want 2 doors on the front of the house, and it was like, oh, wait, because you become a bloody stump. It's like, oh, I've got to do something to protect myself here, and so.
And I watched last night, and I thought that was an interesting one because if it was a single-family home and it had a nice covered porch with the main entrance and French doors that open, should we prohibit that? That's 2 doors on the front of a house.
Right.
Right. So it's one of those things that popped into my mind.
Yeah. So I do think education is a huge part. The other thing, and I forget where you're going next. Are you going to setbacks? Where are you going next?
Width.
Oh, the width, yeah. Because the thing that comes up over and over again from a former planning commissioner is something lifted out of the missing middle book about side setbacks. And that came up again last night, I think.
I can touch on that briefly
thank
at the
you.
end. It's not in the presentation, but I can provide context for that as
Yeah.
well.
So much bad information has been spread.
Yeah. So
And it's our duty to teach, I think, and not just, dismiss people as fear-mongering. We got to teach them. And teaching us is the first thing, yeah.
You have to teach, but also and I'm not saying this to be mean, and I don't know how to handle it, but there is a reality of property ownership. And and I'm not using Steve as an example, there have been other examples of people who've come before us too, that I've owned this house for 45 or 50 years, and it's always been the same. And again, I went to law school, right? So I think legally, we're lucky. If you didn't buy the piece of land next to you so you could control it, or behind you or whatever, you've been very lucky, because legally, if people are building within a legal document, a code or whatever, there is nothing you can do about it. You may not like it. You may think, oh, well, my life has changed because of it. I get that. But really, there's a limit to what we can do. This is what the legalities are. And I hope people think about that too. If you're so worried, then buy the piece of land, if you can, so you can control it. And life is going to move on, and development will move on. It has in every place I've ever lived. And so I have a little bit of a tough time with human behavior where it relates to the law.
So I'm a little more understanding. We are witnessing the gentrification of Traverse City. There's no question about that.
It already happened.
Yeah, and so, you know, the people who are sad or angry, I feel a little bad for them, you know. They can't buy the side lot, you know, I mean,
I
you know, they
understand.
can't, they can't build another story.
I know they
can't,
can't, but
yeah.
that's the legal reality.
Right.
But also gentrification, this term has been thrown out so much that I just want to scream, because it means that wealthy people come into a poor neighborhood and kick the poor people out. So that is the definition of gentrification. It happened already many years ago. It's not happening now. It already happened if you go by that definition. So I'm not trying to not be understanding, but it's a balance. It's a balance of what we can do. It's a balance of what we cannot do. You know, I had somebody call me because something new got built next to her, all within code, but she had planted a shade garden 20 years ago, and now a sun garden 20 years ago. Now her garden was going to die because this building has cut off the sunlight to the garden. I don't know what to say to that, yeah, quite honestly, you know, if everything's within the law.
There are legal precedents for suing about a right to sunlight.
I've never heard that.
Mitch has been out in the trenches. He knows what's going on.
Though what the cases that have gotten the most attention are over in California, but who knows? Maybe some lawyer could find some hay to make out of there.
So,
But if I can, I'd like to just bring up two things while we're still on building height. One, none of these measures include, we don't have elevator shafts in single-family houses or houses that are built to look like single families as much. It doesn't include a tower, a cupola, an air vent, a weather vane, a clock tower. So it's just the normal roof line. Good to know.
Yep.
My other question is that frankly, I'd be interested, and this is something that puts the onus even more on the landowner and developer than the city, but in looking at building height from the other direction. Yes, you can say that a two-story house on a block of one-story houses is larger and maybe out of character, but by that same measure, a one-story house on Washington Street surrounded by 2.5 or 3-story houses is also out of character.
I can think of one in particular on Washington.
Yes, that's why I mentioned
Yeah.
that street.
but that's right.
And
And it all depends on the time in which they were built.
well, and I don't know if that particular case, but other places where it's similar, you've got larger houses or houses that are X number of feet per lot or so many height. In some of those cases, it was because there was a house fire or the house was otherwise vacant for 20 years and then was just torn down, and then it was 1955 and people were building a smaller mid-century ranch house rather than the 1880s lumber baron mansion that got built back then. As far as having a minimum height requirement, that could get just as cumbersome as or even more cumbersome than a maximum height requirement, but as I don't know if everybody else received it, I would be interested in having minimum height requirements along certain corridors or in other parts of town.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. We've instituted that along 8th Street now and stuff, and I think once we get through these planning projects and have some time and direction, I think that's definitely worth diving into. If I may make a suggestion, I've heard various different viewpoints on pursuing this as a change or not. given that we're going to have at least 4, potentially 5 new planning commissioners in the coming months,
Potentially 4.
well, we have 3 resignations.
Oh, planning
You're not-
commissioners.
Planning
Oh,
commissioners.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
There's going to be more people seated at the table for these conversations. It may take some time because the new commission, whoever it may be, has to get set. They have to have the organization meeting. They have to set their ad hoc or create their ad hoc to make their selections. Maybe we bring this, and for that matter, the next topic, back when we get a full commission and we start talking about our annual goals and decide collectively if that's something that we want to pursue as a priority. Does that work?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a
I
good
have to
idea.
say, it is unforgivable that you have had openings since June, is it June? And they're not been filled. And I brought it up at the meeting, and no one was taking responsibility, so I plan on continuing to pursue that,
We
because
have another opening.
it
now.
is, I know, it is not acceptable that that happened. And so I don't know if you talk about that at staff meetings, and if it's, I don't know where the ball was dropped, but it's ridiculous. So,
I appreciate your statement.
yeah,
Yeah.
I did too.
As somebody that has been nominally on the ad hoc to appoint another planning commissioner.
Oh, you have?
Yes, but we haven't had meetings to interview a sufficient number of candidates.
Is it that there's not enough candidates?
No,
Oh.
but it's scheduling, and I don't know how much of that comes down to the availability of time, or even scheduling when the scheduling happens.
It doesn't
If it-
matter. Shouldn't have gone on for 3 months.
Yes.
No excuse.
Indeed.
All right, so I think we've agreed that we're going to wait.
And I don't, from my perspective, I'm comfortable with this because I'm appreciating just the educational opportunity to have the conversation. I think there's value in that alone. So with that, we'll move on to lot width. So the concern is people coming in, acquiring numerous adjacent lots, combining them, and then building a house out of scale with surrounding structures, which I completely understand. I've had the chance to talk to the clerk's office, so when someone wants to do any kind of boundary line adjustment, so that's a land division or a combination, they go through the clerk's office. I've talked to assessing, I've talked to Dave Weston, who reviews those applications on our end. That is not something that's actually occurring really right now. It's very rare to have lot combinations. First of all, you have to have, like, I hear the example all the time of, well, what if someone buys 3 homes and wants to build a very large house? Well, you have to have 3 willing home owners who want to sell their property, someone, again, with the means to buy them at this market rate that they're going for right now, just to demolish them and to then build a larger structure. So, what we're seeing more than anything are splits, because there's more value in splitting a lot and building 2 homes than buying 3 homes and ending up with 1 home. Even some of our larger examples that we have out there that people reference, so for instance, there's one on Monroe Street, that was not the result of a lot combination. That was an existing large lot, and so they kind of were able to max out some of their stuff there. So most of the time when we see combinations, we're seeing that with commercial properties. So 124 and 125 and 145 Hall Street. Those are 2 separate properties that were combined. Well, it's a condition of their land use permit to build a Novo's Hall Street development. The other one is where Marriott Tribute is, so 211, 221 Grandview. Those parcels were combined for a larger commercial property. And so I say that because I do understand the concern. Again, speaking with a member of the HDC, the concern was, well, what if an investor comes in and wants to do that? I would imagine that you're going to make more money renting 3 properties than tearing them all down, losing that overhead, and building 1 and renting out 1 property. I could be wrong, but
It will be less likely to be an investor so much as somebody that is very wealthy and wants to put their mansion somewhere, in which case they'd be further limited as far as location. Say they'd want waterfront and might try to combine several waterfront parcels.
and that's what the assessing office told me, working with their partners in the county, like, that's where they're seeing the big homes, is where you have that land to buy, because, we are fairly built out. We've looked at those maps where our vacant lots are, and there aren't many, so you really do have to get, property acquisition to occur before you can do some of this. But it was something that has been discussed, so I wanted to bring it for conversation. So one thing that we could possibly explore, and I'd want to look at this more with Lauren, is establishing a maximum lot width, which may prevent that from happening. So you couldn't combine too many lots to make a real large one, because really it's the width of the house as perceived from the street that makes it feel out of scale. And I'll show you the example here in a second. You know, you don't really perceive the depth of the house. So if someone wanted to build a large house with depth, you know, that doesn't have the same impact on the character of the neighborhood, or again, that public realm that we've talked about. So, you know, one idea that you could take is establishing similar approach to the front setbacks. So you could look at each block individually and determine, okay, what is the average lot width? And then, you know, what's a good range from that average that we're willing to accept? It would take a lot of work. I don't know, again, given the infrequency of combinations happening, if that's worth it, but that's a direction that you guys can provide for us. But, you know, one thing I want to point out is there is a lot of variation that already exists within our blocks in terms of lot width. And, you know, there could be concerns there about nonconformities. And now all of a sudden, if you set you have to be within, you know, 10 feet of the average per block, and there happens to be an existing very large lot, well, that's now a non-conforming lot. So now that property owner has the burden of, anytime they want to do an improvement, likely having to get a variance from the BZA and stuff like that. So, you know, cost-benefit analysis there. So here's one house that has been mentioned, and it's weird how, you know, one project, this was 21 years ago when it got
Where is
approved.
that? Where's that?
Used to be referred to, it's on 6th Street, the Inman House. You'll recognize it from the front. It is a very large house. It is maxed out. If you look right here, let me get a thing.
What is the impervious surface
This
area
is
on
most,
Yeah, impervious surface and
100%.
that? No, it's not 100%, but it looks more than 50.
yep. But you gotta keep in mind, they don't count patios, walkways, things like that, just the structures and the parking areas. But this is the primary structure of the house, which, as you can see, is not that out of scale of what was around it. But when they went to build their addition, they went to the back. Now, you'll notice that the addition is
It's no
set back.
wider than the house?
What's that?
It's no wider than the house?
No, because it was non-conforming, this original structure. It's too close to the property line.
Yeah.
It doesn't meet the side setback, so you can see where it's set back there. But yeah, it's very, very large, no doubt about it. But when looked at from the front, you don't notice that scale, because the width of the lot, if you go back here, the width of the lot is very similar to all the other ones. However, even from the back, Brooke went and took this picture from the alley, and they actually pulled up while she was doing that. But the two-story garage kind of hides the scale of the house from the alley side as well. But once you start looking at it from the side, you can really start to see more of an imposing mass. Again, I want to point out, not flat roof, because I feel like a lot of times flat roofs get tagged as the mass intruders.
Well, look at it to what was next door to it, too.
Yeah, exactly. And so here's some of the other side.
the
is-
masked intruders. There's a book title in it.
You know, but I do want to point out too that this was a project approved by the Historic District Commission for architectural reasons. So,
And yeah, you can't argue that the addition doesn't have similarities in roof pitches, windows, siding, and
Yep, it
styling.
does. And-
It's basically, they just took the existing house, rotated it 90 degrees, and stuck it on the back.
I would agree. But I think this image, with everything you've seen about the size of this house, you know, the width of the lot prevents it from feeling too out of scale. If you weren't familiar, now it sounds like Commissioner Knapp is familiar with this house, you know, but you happen to just be passing by, you may not notice all of that. So the last thing I want to end on there, as I mentioned in the preface of lot width, is that we do have a lot of variation. So we just happen to be talking about that large house on Monroe Street. So here's one block, for example. You know, we have 8 lots. The average is 55.6 feet. Well, you have 57.3 feet between the widest and narrowest lots, or, you know, a 250% wider lot from the narrowest one. So again, just looking at one block, that's the type of variation. Most of the lots, like within the core of the residential neighborhoods, when they were platted, were 25 feet by 165. Most people purchased 2 lots, so most lots today are 50 by 165. And if you look at the legal description, it'll say like lot 8 and 7 of block 12 of Hannah and Lay's second edition or something like that.
And just considering the time it was, those platted lots might not match the surveyed lots exactly. You can have deviations of inches to feet.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And then there's been some cases where, you know, you have a 25-foot lot, 25-foot and 25-foot, and the one in the middle gets split and goes to the two. So then you get like that weird 37.5 and stuff in there. So there is variation that exists. I'm just putting that out there as part of the conversation. If you're fine with it, I would take the similar approach of let's bring this back as we set our goals and things of that nature. So,
Yeah, one thing that I've mentioned to you before, but I would be interested in, not saying that we're replatting because that is entirely too much work, but if there are ways that we can facilitate cleaning up irregularities in lot width, say, where you've got, if I'm looking at the base of the peninsula, a lot of places where how wide a lot is hard to define because you've got strangely angled lots. If we can encourage lot adjustments in a way that make those parcels a little more rectilinear.
yeah, I mean, we as a city can't do that, though. I see what you're saying, but
Yeah,
we
we
can't
can't-
change someone's property lines on them. But, you know, in the case of those non-parallel side lot lines, we do have a method in place, and we measure the width at the front setback line. So that's how we can establish whether they're meeting the width or not. Because there's a few places where we do have cul-de-sacs, which typically have
Yeah.
those type of pie
But
shaped
I'm
lots.
thinking about, with what we passed last night, if you're looking at what is potentially now developable area, you might have, okay, if you slice off 10 feet of this parcel and the back of this parcel, then you can put something there, but either way with parcels as they are now, because there's inconsistent width and it doesn't have a nice, neat rectangular shape, it doesn't allow for that development.
Yeah, and those are some of those constraints that we've been talking about throughout that would limit some of those things that were adopted, in fact, yesterday. So just to wrap up, because Linda, I think it was you who brought up the thing about lot depth.
About what?
Lot depth? Lot depth, you were talking about this, what? Yeah, so,
Setbacks.
yeah, and
The thing that
specific,
she keeps coming up and
and so
quoting
that's
something out of
lot
the book.
depth, and
Yeah.
that's, so, you know, of the 300 pages in here, there's one paragraph that mentions lot depth, and specifically it talks about the context. When you have, which often happens pre-1940s, where that have irregular lot patterns than the scale and form of the building that is allowed. So when you look at the image, it shows side-by-side lots that have different depths, and that's why they're saying regulate the depth of the building so that just because you know, don't rely on rear setbacks alone, because that may still allow for a really long building. However, that's not really applicable in Traverse City. So one reason is, for most parts of the city, what do we have running along the rear property line? So you can't, they're all the same depth almost, 165 feet. Now, some blocks are different, but they're all pretty much consistent because the alley runs parallel to the street right away. So that's one thing that limits that. The other thing where in that example, that paragraph, they talk about building a really long building, some of those form elements that we have in place already prevent that without having to regulate that depth, because again, it's not necessary. We establish where the building has to sit along the front property line, plus or minus 4 feet. All right, then we have an impervious surface limit that's going to cut off how far back you can go eventually. So you're already indirectly regulating depth. So this context of how they approach it with a specific regulation due to irregular lot depths isn't really applicable. So to demonstrate that, last week we made this map. So what we did was we queried lots that have different depth ranges. Again, right here, that 165 is where most of the city is, and you can kind of see that in the blue, and I'll zoom in a minute here, but some blocks are off a little bit, so we set 10-foot ranges. And what you'll see is, especially with all the interior lots, they're almost all the same depth. You do get variation on the corners, because those corner lots had 2 street frontages, so historically they could be split. And frankly, as the Historic District's chair and I talked about, that's not necessarily bad. It adds variety at the corner of blocks compared to the consistency that you see throughout. So even if you go to different parts of town, what you'll notice is Again, very, very consistent blocks for the most part with one another. So the different colors just mean the different lot widths. Now, what you see in gray are the R1B districts that did not fall within those ranges that I did. Either they were too high or too small. Most of those properties are the schools that we have, or some really, really tiny lots. So this is the old Oak Park School, I believe it is, right here. And then everything else that you see white is outside of the R1B anyway, so it's not applicable or germane to that conversation. But pretty much anywhere you go in the city, you have blocks of consistent lot depth. So that's why that regulation isn't really applicable or necessary in our city, given the other regulatory structures that we have in place. Where that does start to fall apart is, you do get more variation where you have these strange street patterns. And then over on the east side, where you just have much more curvilinear roads and things like that, and that's resulting in different lots and orientations to different streets. But even up here, like by Comanche, pretty much each block has consistent depths to it. So glad the question came up. We were prepared because we knew it
Yeah,
might, 'cause I know
good.
we've been asked a lot. But
And did it also come up about side setbacks last night?
Yeah.
That came up as well.
that part I don't recall. I mean, it did, but I don't know what the question was. So
Are there side setbacks?
Yes,
are there side setbacks? Oh, yeah, we have, all the side setbacks.
unless you're in R3 or commercial.
R3 has side yard setbacks. It's mostly our commercial districts that are 0%.
So that'd be another thing to put in the educational piece. The other thing that came up, and I'm sure you saw this, was, and I think you were involved in this question, if you can have a 2,500 square foot house on your property and you build a duplex, can there be a 5,000 square foot house? But that doesn't work with setbacks, right? And that got bandied about.
it
And
depends
somebody
on-
said, well, no, of course, it can only be the size of a house. But I think what they meant was it can only be the size that fits on that piece of property. So that didn't get related very well last night either, I didn't think.
Yeah, I mean, the building footprint, if there was no parking, so let's take that out of the equation to make it simple. The building footprint, if it's 35%, you got a 10,000 square foot lot, then the footprint of the building could be 3,500 square feet. But, drop that down to a 5,000 square foot lot, now you're looking at 1,750 for that. Yep, so, yeah,
So we're not changing, maybe that's the piece that needs to be told. Just because it's a duplex, we're not changing anything about the requirements of setbacks and impervious surface
Yeah.
or anything. It's
No,
got
and
to
that's
follow
getting
the
back
same
more
rules.
to that form element.
Yeah.
We're regulating the single family or the duplex with the same dimensional standards, but caring less about what's inside, but the shape
Right.
of the
Right.
structure.
Yeah, the only change that affects the building envelope is impervious surface, that then if you're increasing within that 5% range, you need to conform with our now strengthened zoning code. And that doesn't, there's no requirement that if you're going from 30 to 35% or 45 to 50%, depending on zoning district, that you're building a duplex. You could be just building a very large house.
Jim, do you remember anything else? You were there last night, weren't you? Do you remember anything else that came up that we, no? Okay. Okay.
No, not that one.
So, at least for our zoning code, from my reading, it would work, but maybe you know of some reason other than just finances and construction practicality. Is there a reason that somebody couldn't purchase one of the, or maybe they already own, a lot on the base, at the base of the peninsula, which is R1A, and because their lot is over 4 acres, develop a house that's 35 feet, maxed out with setbacks, and through that, have a single house that's 100,000 square feet in area.
Yeah.
That's probably what happened on Skigamog. I don't know what you're talking about.
You do?
Yeah.
There's not a single house in Michigan over 100,000 square feet, but
But it could.
Yeah, in our zoning.
I missed, did you answer that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, you know, I mean, it hasn't happened. I think I know what parcel you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, all we've had is people coming in, figuring out how to subdivide the parcel to build more houses, because that's, you know, that's where you make your money as a builder.
Yeah, like for that, there'd be the situation of Cancer Treatment Centers for America doctor, I forget his name, that purchased 3 lots in Leelanau County on Lake Leelanau, merged them together and built the largest house in northern Michigan. But that's a very rare case of how many people are in that situation, and that's why he ended up in a expensive for the township fight about what his tax assessment really was, because he argued, okay, you might say that based on square footage and lake frontage and whatever, that this is a $28 million house, but there is a very limited number of people that can actually purchase a house for $28 million, so I'm going to say it's $6 million.
I would agree.
And yeah, if we're talking about in Traverse City, the parcels along West Bay that are long, they are much more amenable to having, say, 5 houses that are close together with a shared driveway and shared beach access.
Correct. Well, that's all I had on this.
Very informative.
Well, thank you. I'll leave you with one quote, and I keep this in my actual zoning binder. And I reflect on it sometimes when we're talking about regulations. So regulations can and often do have unintended consequences, especially if the regulations are too strict or onerous. As we make plans for healthy, attractive communities in Grand Traverse County, we need to critique the existing regulations and ask, are we requiring too much? Are we unnecessarily making the cost of living and doing business in our towns and villages too expensive or difficult? Are we driving folks out into the hinterlands where more resources are consumed and travel times are increased? Are we unnecessarily forcing compatible uses to be separated? We need to make sure that the regulations are helping us achieve our vision and not move us in the opposite direction. If we want developers to play by the rules, let's make sure we have the right set of rules. And that is the quote by Russ Soyering that I keep in my
figured.
binder. So, and I reflect back on that a lot as we talk about regulations, and going back to the beginning, you know, when Lauren, the city attorney, and I were talking, what are the problems we're trying to fix? We're talking sometimes about solutions before we fully identify the problem, and as we bring this topic back, maybe at the first of the year, we can kind of focus on that mindset, or that way to phrase it.
Maybe we need to take another step back, which it was something like that in that quote, is what do we want? What do we want to be? You know, and then move into other questions.
I would agree.
Which is why I think people brought up the master planning process coming first.
Even though that doesn't prescribe
Does not,
changes.
It
does
does.
not, but it does
It only
supposedly
does
show a vision.
so much,
Yeah.
right?
Isn't the housing chapter already done?
Yes,
Isn't it all already done?
basically.
Pretty close.
I mean, all of it has been written in draft form,
Yeah.
yeah, and reviewed.
There are ways that a master plan could be used as a cudgel for zoning, which is saying, for example, if you have predominantly single-family housing in a given neighborhood, even if you have duplexes and triplexes, it could stress that that is the prevailing character and what the city is endeavoring to preserve.
Again, again, in terms of education, I mentioned last night, and I hope it's true, that you're seeing excited people coming in with options or ideas of things that they had wanted to do that might be able to be done now. And let's keep those in the forefront and maybe feature those in the Bay Brief as well, or something. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I will say Dave had a handful of calls already today, just kind of inquiring, like, so based on what happened, tell me what's possible type thing.
Yeah.
It's making people think. So.
Yeah.
I think Chief Teller may have had a question.
Oh, do you have a question, Chief Tubb?
Yeah, just real quick. Thanks for the quote there, by the way, Sean. That was awesome. You know, the regulations, and maybe it's a little philosophical, but I get frustrated sometimes being on the board because we're almost 100% reactive. something happens, and then we go, well, that's not right, so we gotta, somehow figure to bring that back over here in the middle, and bring that over here in the middle. And, it would be nice if we, could not rely on, or not have to be like that all the time, reactive. But the flip side of that is if we go out there looking and anticipating what might go wrong or what might not be the correct thing, and then we kind of get into a fuzzy area as well. So trying to find that balance is a challenge I work on. I'm getting better at it, hopefully, but it's to be reactive, but also anticipate, but not be overly so either way.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance. I appreciate that.
Any more discussion, questions, comments? We're going to move on to announcements then.
Yeah, so I have a couple. First, as you guys know, Topher Martin, due to a change in his job at the state, had to resign last week. It conflicted with the meeting dates, and just didn't get the opportunity, but like to publicly thank him for his service and appreciating his voice at this table. With that, Linda, I believe this is your last meeting with us.
Is it? So there's one on the 7th. We're supposed to serve until the 13th, and you don't have enough people. Do you need us to come on the 7th?
Well,
No,
Or do we have
No?
a meeting on the 7th? That's 11th.
we
there
don't
be
have
video?
meetings on the 7th because,
it would be moved to the 8th
yes.
because
So
of the election.
Technically, according to Richard, we're on the clock until the 13th.
So we'll jump to that topic on my announcements. Right now, we don't have anything scheduled for the 8th. We may, depending on some master plan stuff. So I don't know for certain.
I'm willing to come to give you a quorum.
Okay,
We're
I
gonna move
appreciate
on.
that.
So,
But just know if we don't see you there, we also
Yeah.
have appreciated your voice and setting the tone and demeanor there. And Mitch, we don't know,
Yeah.
you're up for an election, so, and you're a city commission liaison. We could see you on the 8th, we could see you today, we could see you for 4 more years, we don't know. So, just know that whatever happens, Mitch, you've been appreciated as well. As you demonstrated today, you take extreme time digging into and reviewing information and research and things like that. So, yeah, we have had a lot of turnover on this commission recently for a variety of reasons, and more to come as, there's elections coming and things like that. So,
Potentially, as of this time next month, we could have only 3 voting members of this board still here.
Yeah, I mean, until the city commission starts making appointments, I just want to say it's really important that if you can't be at a meeting, you let Sean or Laura know right away until we can fill all these spots.
But on that note, per bylaws, the seat isn't in somebody else's hands until a new person has been
That's-
appointed.
that's
So
true.
any of the 3 people that had resigned could have shown up at this meeting and still been able to vote.
That does bring up an interesting point, though. I guess you still have to be on the city, because the rule is you stay on until the city commission fills the spot. So is that true for Linda? Can she, even though she won't be a commissioner anymore, can she still stay on? I guess not. 'Cause she's not.
Yeah,
It's a
well,
weird
it
area.
would,
Because
the-
here for the
Because
city.
she's not,
Yeah.
she's not appointed.
Yeah.
That only applies to the appointed
yeah,
members.
and that would go into effect until November 13th, which is the organization meeting, which would change who the city commissioners
true.
that sit on this are. But at November 8th, if we had a meeting, that would be after the election, but before
Yeah.
the new terms have taken effect.
Both of them could come on November 8th.
Yeah, technically.
Okay.
Um,
Any other announcements?
Yeah, a couple others. Wednesday at 4 o'clock, the Mobility Action Plan Leadership Team is meeting to review the revised draft. They've already met before, provided edits. Those have been incorporated. The intent is for them to give it their final blessing and recommend moving it to the Planning Commission for that review process. Similarly, the master plan is wrapping up. That leadership team is meeting 3:30 on Wednesday. They'll, Thursday, thank you, be reviewing the action plan items for the next 5 years, what the whole process has kind of led to pointing us to. Of course, it establishes a vision and goals and things like that, or guiding principles, but these are some of the action items. With that getting incorporated, that process for review will begin as well. So hopefully, again, we get those planning commissioners set. Still, you've seen it in packets before, and it's been pulled, but the Ida Tompkins building, working with the party that is engaged in negotiations with TCAPS right now, met with them yesterday. It's really coming down to their decision of when they want to apply, and there's a lot of strategic things, but they're looking at having that rezoned. A new thing is we recently got informed by Housing and Urban Development that based on the census information, we are now a Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG, entitlement grantee, which are federal dollars that we are now entitled to of up to $372,000 a year for various programs. I have a kickoff meeting with the Detroit Field Office tomorrow, I think, at 11 o'clock, to learn more about that. So there's different ways you can use that money. Our interim assistant city manager, when he was in Farmington Hills, they used it for housing rehabilitation programs throughout the city. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that. Yeah, it does have a lot of paperwork. It's federal money and a lot of annual plans. But you can use some of that money to pay for the administration of it. So the county gets some money and they use Venture North for it. So we'll be having a meeting with them too to talk about administration. We did interview 2 candidates for the deputy planner position on Friday, both great. We have a third one who got a little fender bender that day, so that's been rescheduled. Everything's fine, but yep. And I'll keep you posted on November 8th. You know, it is hard with the small, if we have no real action items to vote on, I don't really necessarily want to bring you in. We'll wait till we rebuild the commission and start doing our work again and get there. So that's all I have.
Good.
Nothing about a week and a half ago?
Oh, last month's been a blur for me. I don't. We had the planning conference? Yeah, we did have the planning conference. Mitch was there. Debbie unfortunately couldn't attend. Laura came. She brought her pumpkin purse. That was a whole thing.
It was a whole thing.
It was a whole thing. But it was good. I had the opportunity to lead a presentation with Suzanne Schultz of Progressive AE on, navigating change in a sensitive community. It was fun. We took a different approach to it in that.
7 dad jokes.
Well, at the conference, everyone's sitting there doing lecture style. So we're halfway through day 2 after lunch, and Suzanne had a great idea. She's like, everyone's going to get tired. Let's just pretend we're at the bar having a conversation. So we just talk to each other instead of talking to a PowerPoint. A lot of great tours, great turnout. Next time they circle back here in a few years, we're going to try to convince them to host it in town, not at the resort, now that we have more venue space. After all, we spent 3 days talking about walkable communities. I think we could walk from the Bijou to the State to the Opera House and things like that.
Well, there was the downtown walking tour, but then you need to drive downtown
Right,
or
to get there.
have a shuttle bus.
Yeah, and they would run shuttles at night to downtown. Like, maybe you just need to move it downtown. So
There's also a housing conference coming up towards the end of this month.
Who's going? I'm going.
I'm going.
Jerry and I are doing a presentation with Aspire North on mapping to show where housing can go, so we'll be there for some of it.
And in the next 3 days, there's Michigan Municipal League's conference, also at the resort.
We are conferenced out.
We are conferencing. Okay, well, I think no public comment, obviously.
Yep.
So does anybody else
We've got a jacket.
Anybody else have anything to say for the greater good? Then we are going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm an architect, real estate.
Oh, yeah.